I like to build clocks, and I like to design the clock faces. I've built lots of little table clocks. Here's kind of a fun Porsche clock that I built. Here's a table clock or a wall clock. It go either way. Here's another giant wall clock. That was kind of a fun face. I took a picture of a cymbal from a drum set and put the numerals over the top of that. Here's another wall clock. I came across a little clock that looks like this, and I thought I'd try to make it. Just a little occasional table clock. This is tiny. It's only about 4.5 inches tall, and you'll see here in a minute when I rotate it how small it really is. And I just thought I would try my hand at building it. That curved top seemed kind of intriguing, and also just the compact size. It makes for a very nice looking small little table clock. Here's sort of the idea of all of its pieces, and I'll review all this stuff in a minute. I had some 5/4 Beech and some 8/4 Birch, and I thought I'd make one of each of these clocks. Here is my dado blade to start shaping the sides. They are just made up of a large L-shaped dadoed piece of wood, and then mitered on 4 corners and joined together to make sort of the box for the clock. So what I'm doing here is making the sides and the top and the bottom of both clocks. These are the birch pieces of wood, and once I've cut these, I set that dado blade about 1/8 of an inch away from the fence in order to leave a little piece of wood to support the cut, and then later I remove that piece of wood with a plane to get the L-shaped piece of wood that would be required to make the 4-sided, you could say, the frame of the clock. The clock's about 2 inches deep, about 4.5 inches tall, and about 2 3/4 inches wide. So these cuts that I just made with the dado blade were for the top, bottom, and sides of both clocks, the Birch clock and the Beech clock. Then these boxes are made up of 4 sides that are mitered at 45 degrees. So I simply just set my saw blade at a 45-degree angle. I tend to double check and triple check that angle using a drafting triangle. And once I have that right, I've built this little sled for cutting things at an angle. And you can see here I've got stacked up the sides of both clocks, the Birch and the Beech, and I'm cutting the first 45-degree angle in that frame. And then here I've cut the second 45-degree angle in that frame. And then once I have those pieces cut, you can see how this lays together. I just simply use painter's tape to join the corners. Since it's 2 inches tall, I was able to use the painter's tape in its full width, and actually you get I'd say a pretty strong little hinge when you do that. I put on a pretty liberal amount of glue on both surfaces of all 8 ends, you could say, then just used a little throwaway brush to spread the glue evenly again on both surfaces. Because it's end grain, I think it's good to sort of treat the wood with the glue to fill in the pores, etc. And because these were 5/4 pieces of wood, you had a lot of surface to glue. So I think a combination of glue on both pieces and the large surface, you'll see this in a minute as I fold it together, it makes a fairly compact little box, and I've had no failures with this kind of an operation in gluing things together. Once you fold this, then you just pinch it on that fourth corner, put a final piece of painter's tape on that, and kind of double check it for square and flushness. I generally use a square up against that just to make sure I've got 90-degree corners. Then I just very lightly with these wooden clamps, very lightly press on all four directions. Again, because these things were 5/4 thick, they had a lot of surface, and they bore on each other in a very level way. So once I did that, I let them go overnight, pulled them back out of the clamps the next day, pulled the tape off, and I had 2 little boxes in order to go to town on here. Now once you have these boxes made, again, these are with 5/4 thick sides, the clock's going to end up at 5/8 of an inch, and you'll see why in a minute, that I held off ripping the clock to size until I had cut the curve in the top, because I didn't want to be cutting this giant curve up against end grain and have tear out problems. Once you have the outer box built, you have to build sort of an inner box, and so I ran some beech and some birch through my planer, got it down to about 3/8 of an inch thick, and then with my blade and a feather board, I was able to again make a rabbet. You can see a very thin rabbet to make these inner boxes. The inner box holds the clock face, holds the clock movement, and it also presses on the piece of glass. So just like the outer box, the inner box is cut at 45s. Again, I use tape as my hinges, paint some glue on all these surfaces, fold them up, and create the little inner box. Again, you can see the rabbet in that inner box is to hold the clock face. The rabbet in the outer box is to hold the clock glass. Now for cutting that curve at the top. This was the hardest part of building this thing. And here is just an illustration. I built a little jig to hold the clock, and then used a flush cut router bit and a plunge router to basically plunge my way down the face of that curve, getting the full width of that curve cut. Here I am 2 or 3 passes into it with that router bit. Again, I would make a cut across, plunge it another 3/8 of an inch or so, make a cut across again, plunge it again until I'd finished making that cut. Now the reason I left the clock body at 5/4 thickness is that so at the end and the beginning of this router cut, I wouldn't have tear out that I couldn't deal with later. So I cut the curve in the top of the clock before I ripped the clock to width. And here's just an idea of what that looks like. Here's the box made out of the 4 parts at 5/4 thickness. And then next to it here is the box after I had cut that curve in the top. You can see it's going beyond the 45-degree mark because I haven't ripped it yet. Here's the box with the 2 sides ripped off. You can see I'm moving the arrow there, ripping those sides down to 5/8 of an inch. And then I finally cut the bottom off at 5/8 of an inch, and you end up with the finished clock face with 5/8 inches on all 4 sides and the curve at the top. And that's the look that I wanted to achieve with this little clock. Just to show you again how the parts go together, here is the representation of the outer box. Here's the inner box sliding out of that. There's the piece of glass. I'll show you where I got the glass in a moment here. And then you can see the clock movement and the clock face are both held by the inner box, or that rear box. And that's how the clock goes together. You put the face into the box, you put the movement on the face, you slide the glass in and slide the back in. I don't know if you know this, but at Lowe's, they cut glass for you. So I brought a little template in of the glass I needed for this clock and another one, and they cut my pieces of glass for me there to fit. It's super cheap. I think I got enough glass for, I think, 8 different clocks for about $6. So it's really, really inexpensive. Here are some printed faces that I was working on for that clock. Here's some printed faces for another clock I'm working on. These were black and white, just trials to see how they fit. Here it is printed on buff colored paper, and this is the finished product for the small clock that I'm working on here. There's no science to this. I just print them to be the exact size of the piece of wood that becomes the clock face. And once I've done that, I trim those to fit so that they'll be centered. There's the clock face. It's just a little piece of 3/16 plywood. And I use a spray-on contact adhesive. I spray that piece of wood and then contact the frame or the face to the piece of wood, and then using an X-Acto knife, I cut the edges so that it's trimmed to fit tightly and centered in the clock. And the only part about this that's a little tricky is these faces are just paper, and you want to try to keep them clean. So you don't want to have dirty fingers or other things going on in the room that could soil the faces. I'd already cut the little piece of plywood to fit the rabbit cut in the small inner box, so I knew it was a perfect fit. And so now I was just transferring that fit to the paper face using a straight edge and an X-Acto knife to get the face to fit that piece of plywood pretty much exactly. And then I just very carefully set it on the piece of plywood, flush on the edges, so that again, as the face is inserted in the clock, it ends up centered well. Also, when I print these faces, I print a circle and a dot in the middle, because you need to know where the clock mechanism is going to ride. And once I've done that, I drill that center with a piece of paper protecting the clock face and another piece of plywood on top of that piece. I sort of sandwich that drilled hole and then drill it on the drill press in order to not tear up the face. You end up getting a nice clean circle cut in the face and in the piece of plywood that accepts the clock movement shaft. And then they come with a little washer and a little nut, and I just tighten that up on there using needle nose pliers, and you can get that fairly tight. Once this clock is put together, you really never mess with it again. Every time you change the battery, it might jiggle a little bit. Sometimes I've glued a piece of wood to the back of the face just to keep those movements from turning, but it's not all that important. So there's the outer box there with the piece of glass, and that piece of glass just rides in here. You can see the groove, by the way, that I've cut in the bottom and the top. That's going to accept a back piece of plastic for the back. I'll show you that in a second. So that piece of glass fits in there tightly. The face is already in the inner box. The clock mechanism is already in the inner box. That just slides in there. And then the back piece of plastic is what holds that whole thing together. and you end up with a nice little package. Easy to pull the back off anytime the battery's dead or anytime you need to readjust the clock. Time setting, and I thought it made a very nice little clock. Made the whole thing in a couple days, couple afternoons. These clock hands are a little too fat for my liking. I've ordered some skinnier ones. I think that will make it look a lot better. But here's the final clock. I decided to do this with Roman numerals. I made the second one using Arabic numerals. It doesn't matter. Again, clock faces are half the fun of designing these, and I think this made a very nice little clock. Something that you could give away as a gift or sell on Etsy or whatever you might want to do. Thanks for watching. Hope you've enjoyed the video. If so, please subscribe. And thanks again.